knowing about ancient Greek philosophy and having access to the texts, although of course they were written in a rather more difficult Greek than the Greek of the Gospels, meant that teachers who had been involved in instructing mainly young men, but also, as we know from Hypatia, young women when they were very bright and very demanding, they had a sense of philosophy which I think was very real and very important, particularly in the notion of paideia, in education, and the importance of being aware of what the ancients had said about the world, about the creation of the world, about how the world functions, about how the gods intervene in the world. Clearly, there was very little direct influence that I know of the rituals and the scandalous stories of the Olympian gods in the Christian dimension. But the notion of understanding divinity and understanding the character that makes a very worthy person, virtue, honor, excellence in activity, all these elements of ancient Greek philosophy percolated into the Christian notion of virtue and honor. And I think it's mainly through the schools and the educators that this transference can be seen. I've recently been reading the work of Michael Champion, who's worked on the schools of Gaza. Gaza in the 4th to 6th centuries was absolutely one of the liveliest places in the Near East after Alexandria. And it had schools with teachers, some of whom were actually very rooted in their ancient Greek pagan beliefs. Others were already Christian and wished to communicate what they felt was so much of value in ancient thinking to Christian students. And they were rivals, and they competed to attract the best students. And they had very interesting methods of communicating the ancient texts, commenting on them, teaching by having the students read and repeat and then think about what they'd said. All this system of education, most of it oral, very little of it written, was incredibly important in incorporating a lot of ancient philosophical ideas into Christian thinking. And in the schools of Gaza, it's quite clear there was a very distinct influence. And I'm quite sure this happened in many, many other places. We know it happened in Alexandria, where there were different sorts of Christians as well as different sorts of pagans. There were people who felt that the earth believed very firmly that the earth was flat. There were others who went along with the spherical earth, and they argued about these matters from their different positions. And most of them, by the 6th century, were Christians, but they still had the same obsessions with the really important issues. And I think that's where we can see how very significant ancient Greek thinking was to the early Christian communities. The biblical authority of figures like Moses, the great prophets, who indeed prophesied the arrival of Jesus, and the adoption of Christianity as a replacement of Judaism. This takes place within a certain framework that we believe was very much influenced by the ancient Greek philosophy, but it wasn't so much influenced by Roman thinking. I think the Roman influence comes through the politics and the military activity that made the empire. And that, of course, is something that was way beyond the experience of the biblical communities and the early Jewish cities, or even the ancient Greek city-state. So the notion of empire and the conquest of areas beyond anybody's wildest dreams by the Romans, was a way of exercising political authority. And that the genius, if you like, is that Constantine the First, the Great, in the early 4th century, having won his great political battle by defeating all his enemies, becoming master not only of Rome, but building new Rome in Constantinople, which really was the sort of acme of achievement of the Roman Empire in a way. He then decided, I think on not very much on religious grounds, that it was necessary to incorporate the Christians. And at that point, he started patronizing the church building, patronizing the bishops, getting them to come together to solve their problems, organizing them into a church. And I think that was a very important political step which married the Roman notion of empire to the idea of an established church. And it brought the Roman history of conquest and military supremacy and all the other very important elements of Roman achievement. Let's not forget legal decisions, very carefully argued, to be fair, to give rights where rights are due, the notion of architectural and engineering skills. I mean, it's not every community that can build the Pont du Gard and carry the water across the top of the Great Bridge. These types of skills became part of imperial wisdom and passed then into the notion of a Christian empire, in which emperor and patriarch or archbishop were to cooperate. And that, I think, is the way in which the Roman notions became part of what we call the Byzantine world. But it's a slow business, and it doesn't seem to me to have very much connection with Aeneas as the founder of Rome and the Romulus and Remus story, and the connection to the Trojan War, which was known to the Greeks, of course, as the Trojan War, not Aeneas going off to found Rome in the West. Homer was so absolutely critical to the whole notion of Greek identity, to the understanding of Greek history, and to the admiration for Homeric verse, which meant that it was still the text that young men had to learn first. So, and that's another thing which is so peculiar, because of course it's very, very different Greek from what you would have heard spoken in the 6th century AD. But that's where you had to begin, because that's where all the stories of our history, of our antiquity, were based.